If you look at a satellite image of the Earth at night, it tells a very specific story about power.
Oh, it really does.
Yeah, you see these like blazing webs of light stretching across North America, Europe, parts of Asia. And then you look at the African continent.
Right.
Outside of a few bright clusters, there are just massive stretches of darkness.
It is a striking visual, and it represents a staggering reality. We're looking at a continent where roughly 600 million people still lack access to reliable electricity.
600 million, that's just a huge number. But the thing about that satellite image is that it really only shows you the old way of doing things.
Exactly.
Down there in the dark, there is this massive, almost completely silent technological revolution underway. And that is exactly what we are digging into today. Welcome to the deep dive.
Glad to be here.
Our mission today is to completely reset how you think about energy in the global south. We are moving past the traditional, often very tiring doom and gloom narratives about energy poverty.
Yeah, because we're looking at a profound leapfrog moment right now.
To do this, we are unpacking a really comprehensive piece of literature for you. The full title is A Research Perspective on Advancing and Scaling Renewable Electrification Across Africa. We are going to break down exactly how this study maps out a totally new energy architecture driven by decentralized tech and what that ultimately means for the global energy future.
And as we go through this, I really urge you to shift your perspective a bit.
How so?
Well, consider this electrification push not just as a global strategy to lower carbon emissions. I mean, that is just a co-benefit.
Right.
What we're really talking about is a system-wide economic upgrade, transitioning to a fundamentally more efficient and cost-optimal infrastructure.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand where the future is heading, we first have to look at the massive gap between the official power grid and what is, actually happening on the ground for everyday people.
Right, the reality on the ground.
Yeah, this study highlights a stark urban-rural divide. Take Ethiopia, for example. The urban electrification rate is sitting at a pretty solid 96%.
Which is great.
It is, but out in the rural areas, it plummets to around 35%.
Yeah, and that's because the centralized grids, the massive power plants, the long-distance transmission lines, they simply aren't reaching everyone.
Right.
The legacy utility model assumes you build a giant plant and slowly spiderweb wires out to every village. But that interconnection remains incredibly inaccessible for a huge portion of the population, despite, decades of effort to expand it.
So are we looking at an energy version of the mobile phone revolution here?
Oh, that's a good way to frame it.
Because, a couple of decades ago, people in rural areas didn't sit around waiting for telecom companies to come string up miles of copper telephone wire.
No, they didn't.
They just skipped the telephone poles entirely and went straight to cell towers. Are people doing the exact same thing now, but skipping the utility poles and going straight to solar panels?
The data absolutely backs up your analogy. Yeah. This study refers to this exact phenomenon as solarization.
Solarization.
Right. It is the rapid diffusion of solar photovoltaics, driven by just plummeting hardware costs. Instead of waiting 10 years for a national utility company to run a power line out to their property.
A farmer can just buy a pallet of solar panels.
Exactly. They buy a few panels, set up a localized microgrid, and run an irrigation pump today. Not in 10 years. Today.
The sheer scale of this invisible boom is what really caught my attention when we were prepping for this.
Yeah, to give you a sense of the momentum, official global models predicted that installed solar capacity in Africa would reach about 23 gigawatts peak by the year 2025.
Okay, 23. And just to clarify that term for you for a moment, a gigawatt peak is the absolute maximum power those panels can generate under perfect midday sunshine. So the official guess was 23 gigawatts peak.
Right. But if you look at Chinese export data, which tracks the actual physical hardware being loaded onto ships.
The actual panels?
Yeah, the physical panels. Over 58 gigawatts peak of solar panels have been exported to Africa since 2017.
Wait, hold on.
Yeah.
The actual deployment on the ground is almost triple the official projections.
It is. And other on-the-ground reports estimate actual deployed capacity might be closer to 64.
They missed it by 40 gigawatts. How do global models completely miss an infrastructure build-out the size of, a medium European country?
Well, they miss it because global energy models are built to track utility-scale projects.
Oh, I see.
Yet they track massive fields of solar panels financed by governments or huge corporations. They are completely blind to millions of individual households, farmers, and small businesses buying a few panels at a time.
It's totally decentralized.
Exactly. It highlights a crucial shift in human behavior. Everyday citizens are transitioning from being passive consumers, waiting for a failing, centralized grid to reach them.
To becoming prosumers.
Prosumers.
Right.
They are actively producing and consuming their own power.
That prosumer revolution is incredibly empowering, literally and figuratively.
Yep.
And the stakes for getting this right couldn't be higher. This study points out a statistical correlation, an R value of 0.83 between electricity access and a country's Human Development Index, or HDI.
That's a massive correlation.
Right. For those of us who haven't taken statistics in a while, an RI value of 0.83 is basically a math nerd's way of saying these two things are virtually locked together.
Yeah. The Human Development Index measures the bedrock of a functioning society. A long and healthy life, being knowledgeable, having a decent standard of living.
Right.
That near-perfect statistical correlation empirically proves that electricity isn't just about turning the lights on so you can read at night.
It's everything else.
It's the fundamental prerequisite for refrigerating vaccines in a clinic, running computers in a school, powering heavy machinery for economic growth.
So decentralized solar is exploding off the grid, and the models are missing it. But let's look at the legacy grids that do exist, because this study reveals a major hidden vulnerability in the centralized systems, and it all comes down to water.
Ah, yes. The hydropower trap.
Yeah, I'm looking at this study and seeing that countries like Zambia, Mozambique, the Democratic Republic of Congo, they already get huge amounts of their power, over 70% in many cases, from hydropower.
They do.
That is a 100% renewable resource. So if their grid is already running on green energy, why are we talking about fixing a system that seems to be working perfectly fine?
Well, having an abundant renewable resource within your borders does not automatically equal reliable electricity access for your population.
Okay, fair.
The Central African Republic and the Democratic Republic of Congo have massive hydro resources, some of the biggest river systems on the planet, yet their actual electricity access rates are less than 25%.
Wow, only 25%.
Yeah, because the physical infrastructure to harness and distribute that power is severely limited.
But what about the countries that do have the giant dams built and are actively using them?
That's where the trap comes in. Relying on hydropower for over 70% of a country's supply leaves that nation dangerously exposed to hydrological variability.
Meaning droughts.
In plain terms, yes. Climate-induced droughts. If your entire country's economy runs on the flow of a single major river, and climate change causes that river to run dry for an entire season,
The turbines stop spinning.
the factories shut down, the grid collapses.
It's a diversification problem. Like, if you put your entire retirement fund into a single tech stock, even if it's a fantastic, high-performing stock, you are incredibly vulnerable.
Right. If that one company has a bad quarter, you lose everything.
And you have to spread the risk around.
Exactly. And the study actually points to Kenya as the gold standard for how to handle this systemic risk.
What are they doing differently?
Kenya has intentionally built a highly diversified mix. Their grid is about 85% renewable overall, but it's split beautifully.
Right.
They pull 43% from geothermal, 28% from hydropower, and 14% from wind power.
That is a remarkably balanced portfolio. The wind blows, the water flows, and the heat from the earth provides a constant baseline that, just doesn't care if it's raining or not.
Exactly. And the study's modeling shows that intentionally diversifying the grid, like this, adding solar, wind, and battery storage to complement the existing hydrovow, it does increase the levelized cost of electricity by about 10 to 20% compared to just building one cheap mega dam.
So it is more expensive upfront to diversify?
It is, but think of that 10 to 20% increase as an insurance premium.
Oh, I like that.
It buys essential resilience against climate shocks. A diversified grid is robust enough to handle the unexpected. A monolithic grid is inherently fragile.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Because if building a resilient, diversified grid is the goal, you have to solve two massive puzzles: the physical geography of the continent and the harsh financial realities of global investment.
Yeah, the money is a huge factor.
Let's talk about the money first. This study uses the term WACC, weighted average cost of capital. To put it in everyday terms, it's like trying to buy a really reliable, fuel-efficient car, but you have a terrible credit score.
That is a very apt comparison.
Right, because even if the sticker price of the car, or in this case the solar panels and wind turbines, is dirt cheap, the interest rate the bank charges you on the loan makes the overall cost astronomical over time.
Yeah, it really does. The study notes the levelized cost of solar ranges from a super cheap 3 cents per kilowatt hour all the way up to 9 cents.
And that variance has nothing to do with the technology itself, right?
Nothing at all. It is entirely driven by financial risks and the cost of borrowing money in a specific country.
So how much money are we actually talking about here?
Well, the African Development Bank estimates that between 32 and 42 billion US dollars is needed annually to build out these modern diversified power systems.
Wow.
Annually.
Annually.
That requires massive institutional investment. But high capital costs, perceived financial risks by foreign investors, macroeconomic instability, it all inflates that WACC.
It just makes it too expensive to borrow.
It makes projects incredibly hard to finance, even when the underlying technology is cheap and perfectly reliable.
Okay, so the financial side is a steep uphill battle. But on the flip side, the study highlights an incredible geographic advantage that might balance the scales.
Yeah, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the physical geography of Africa provides a structural advantage that heavily industrialized regions like Europe can only dream of.
Wait, really? We always hear about how far ahead Europe is on the green transition. How does Africa have a geographic edge over them?
Well, Europe is making great strides, but they are fighting a massive geographic hurdle: seasonality.
Winter.
Winter. When your grid relies heavily on solar power, a European winter means a massive drop in power generation just at the exact moment when heating demand spikes across the continent.
Oh, right, because everyone turns their heaters on.
Exactly. To manage that extreme fluctuation, Europe has to build an incredibly complex, expensive continent-wide transmission grid to shuffle power back and forth across borders.
Like moving wind power generated in the North Sea all the way down to Italy in the winter, or funneling solar power from Spain up to Germany in the summer.
Precisely. This study projects that by 2050, Europe will need cross-border electricity exchanges equal to 17% of its total demand just to balance its grid and keep the lights on.
17%. Okay.
Now, compare that to the geography of Africa. Solar irradiance across the African continent has very little seasonal variation,
The sun shines pretty consistently year-round.
especially near the equator. Because of that consistency, Africa requires significantly less continental-scale transmission infrastructure. The study projects Africa will only need cross-border exchanges equal to about 9% of its total demand.
So they don't have to build these ultra-expensive continental supergrids to the same extent Europe does. The power is generated right where it's needed all year long.
Exactly.
And the decentralized solarization we talked about earlier works perfectly with that natural environment.
It makes a decentralized, solar-heavy architecture mathematically optimal. You don't need a heavy top-down grid if the fuel source is shining equally on every rooftop.
So what does this all mean once a nation actually overcomes that financing hurdle and taps into that geographic advantage? Because the study suggests the energy system stops being just about keeping the lights on. It becomes a massive engine for industrialization.
Yeah, they call it the power-to-X economy.
Or specifically the solar-to-X economy.
Right. This is where the Leapfrog really takes off. Once you have abundant, cheap solar power, you don't just use it to power TVs and refrigerators.
What else do you use it for?
You use it to produce e-hydrogen, e-fuels, green chemicals, and green fertilizers. You use electricity to create tangible, highly valuable, exportable products.
Okay, but let me offer a pushback here. If a massive European corporation sets up a giant solar farm in Namibia, uses all that pristine solar power to make green hydrogen, and then ships all that fuel back to Germany to run European factories,
Yeah.
aren't we just repeating the old ugly colonial extraction model? How does exporting green energy help the person living 5 miles down the road who still doesn't have a reliable power grid?
It's a great point. This raises an important question, and it's a concern frequently debated in development circles. But what this study explicitly finds is that there is no inherent trade-off between export markets and domestic access.
Really?
They actually have a symbiotic relationship.
Symbiotic how? Break down the mechanics of how exporting fuel helps a local off-grid farmer.
It comes down to the concept of an anchor tenant and economies of scale. If you want to build a mega plant for exporting green hydrogen, you need massive infrastructure. You need deep water ports, high voltage transformers, newly paved roads, and vast fields of solar panels.
Right, you need all the foundational stuff.
And the lucrative export market pays for all that heavy infrastructure up front. Once those foundational systems are built, tapping into them to run a local village's microgrid becomes incredibly cheap because the European buyers essentially subsidize the foundation.
Ah, I see.
That massive influx of capital drives down the cost of the underlying technology across the entire local supply chain. You couldn't get the bank loan to build the local grid without the massive export contracts serving as the anchor.
So the massive export demand creates the volume needed to make the unit economics work for everyday people.
Precisely.
But what about the physical resources? Making green hydrogen involves electrolysis, using electricity to split water into hydrogen and oxygen. That requires a lot of water.
It does.
And water scarcity is a huge issue in many parts of the continent. Aren't we just trading precious drinking water for energy exports?
The study addresses this fear directly, too. The techno-economic evidence shows that using seawater desalination to provide the pure water needed for hydrogen production only adds a tiny fraction to the total cost.
Really? How tiny?
We are talking about 1% of total production costs. So for coastal production hubs, freshwater scarcity is not a binding constraint. You just pull from the ocean, desalinate it with cheap solar, and split it.
Only 1%. Wow, that completely deflates that specific argument against the hydrogen economy.
Yeah,
And this abundance of cheap local solar power doesn't just stop at industrial exports, it changes how people move around too, right?
absolutely. The e-mobility boom is already gaining serious traction. Startups raised $2.2 billion in 2024 alone for African e-mobility solutions.
2.2 billion.
Yeah. The study projects that battery electric vehicles charged directly via off-grid solar will be cost-effective across Africa well before 2040.
Charging your car directly from the solar panels on your own roof, completely bypassing the gas station, the oil refinery, and the national utility company.
Yes.
That is the ultimate definition of leapfrogging. But to really optimize all of this, the study points out a pretty glaring gap in how scientists and engineers actually plan these systems.
Yeah, this is a critical call to action for the scientific community. Currently, most energy system models, software tools like Homer or PayPSA, which engineers use to simulate grid behavior and plan infrastructure, they struggle to capture both on-grid and off-grid solutions simultaneously.
Why is that?
Because they were built decades ago for the legacy top-down grids of the global north. Furthermore, the vast majority of research about Africa's energy future is currently conducted in laboratories in Europe.
Oh, wow. So the software models dictating billions of dollars of investment are being built by people who aren't living the reality of the geography, and the software itself can't even comprehend the prosumer revolution happening on the ground.
Exactly. There is a desperate need for more localized research, open-source modeling tools, and greater inclusion of research communities actually based on the African continent to ensure these projections reflect the complex reality on the ground.
Right. Getting the people who live there involved in the modeling. As we wrap up this deep dive, the main takeaway for you listening is this. The electrification happening across Africa right now isn't merely a decarbonization strategy.
No, it's not.
The baseline in many of these countries is already incredibly low carbon.
This is fundamentally about transitioning to a more efficient, cost-optimal system. Emission mitigation is almost just a happy byproduct of building a better, cheaper, smarter grid.
It's about a massive continent-wide upgrade. And that leads to a really provocative thought to leave you with.
Yeah, if African nations successfully leapfrog the centralized fossil fuel grids of the 20th century, what happens in 20 or 30 years? What happens when the global south is running on a fundamentally more efficient, resilient, and decentralized energy architecture than the aging legacy systems of the global north? Who will be learning from whom?
It really makes you wonder. If the global south proves that decentralized off-grid solar is the most resilient way to run a modern economy, how long until neighborhoods in places like Texas or California places dealing with their own fragile, aging power grids and rolling blackouts decide to unplug from the utility pole and start copying the African model?
It's entirely possible.
The places currently in the dark on that satellite map might just be the blueprints for the future of global energy. Thank you for joining us for this exploration of a research perspective on advancing and scaling renewable electrification across Africa. Keep questioning, keep learning, and we'll catch you next time.